So shall we talk some halacha?
Let's do it.
So last week we discussed the Melacha of kotzer, or reaping, and one of the ramifications we saw was that you can't make use of a tree, היינו Ilan, and one of the applications of that for today was sitting on a stump. And we get questions every week from our great audience who are watching this, and one of the questions that came in regarding a dead stump. What happens if the stump is dead? Can you sit on it or not?
So last week, I think we mentioned that it would be a problem, and that's in fact what the Shulchan Aruch says, that it's a problem to make use of a tree, whether it's alive or dead. And that would imply that sitting on a stump would be a problem. We saw that the measurement that the Shulchan Aruch gives is anything above 3 tefachim would be considered a tree and would be a problem on Shabbos. And that is the mainstream position. However, the Aruch HaShulchan does suggest, he doesn't bring any proof for this, but he just suggests on his own accord that perhaps a cut down tree, that is not considered a tree anymore. A stump is something completely different and therefore would not be in the category of a tree that one cannot make use of. So even though it's true, as we said last week, that once we have a gezerah, you can't make use of a tree, it applies to all trees and we don't distinguish between different types of trees. A stump from a cut down tree, that actually might be different and would be permitted. So again, like we said last week, the mainstream position is that it's a problem. However, there is some basis for permitting use of or sitting on a stump on Shabbos.
Great. So for today, the next Melacha in the list of Melachos is Me'amer, which is gathering of the stalk, the fruits, the wheats of anything in the field that was just harvested, that was reaped, and putting it together. And the question is, what Melacha is being done over here? There's no change. There's nothing with a meaning, with thought behind it. You're just gathering things together. Why is this even considered a Melacha?
That's a great question. And to make matters worse, the Gemara says very little about Melachos Me'amer. So one principle is actually subject to debate, but the Gemara has a machlokas whether Me'amer applies to all items that are gathered or only to gidulei karka, only to things that grow in the ground. There are a number of Melachos, as we'll see, where this question is relevant. And here we paskin at first from the Mishnah Berurah that the Melacha of Me'amer only applies to things that grow in the ground. So it's not just bundling anything, it's specifically things that grow in the ground. But there's two other factors found in the Shulchan Aruch that are based on only implications from various Gemaras. One is a Mishnah in Beitzah that says you're allowed to gather firewood on Yontif. And Tosos there in Beitzah asked the question, what about the Melacha of Me'amer? Isn't it a problem to gather on Yontif? And Tosos makes the comment that it must be that Me'amer only applies when it's done b'makom gidulo, when it's done in the place where it actually grew, as opposed to over there where the wood is just being gathered up in a courtyard, but it's not the actual trees in the forest where it grew. That's one condition. The Rambam adds another factor, as he seems to describe Me'amer as sticking or tying things together. Not when you just merely gather items together, but actually they're stuck together to make one whole. Example is figs. They used to eat these cakes of figs. So you take the figs, you stick them together into a big cake. That is a violation of Me'amer. So it's a second factor the Rambam adds, which is that they have to stick together. Now it's not clear if there's a machlokas here. Two opinions disagree with each other, but the Shulchan Aruch quotes both of these, which means that if you gather anything b'makom gidulo, you gather anything in the place where it grew, it would be a violation of Me'amer. And additionally, if you do any type of gathering in which you stick the items, remember of course things that grew in the ground, but stick the items together or tie them together, that would also be a violation of Me'amer. So now going back to your question, you asked, what are you accomplishing when you do Me'amer? So I heard from my Rebbe, Ritzi Sobolovsky, that perhaps both of these factors are addressing that very question that you asked. So perhaps, starting with the Rambams, when you actually stick things together, that is something different. You created something new. It's not the same to have separate figs. It's different. We now have one big cake of figs all together. That's one. And perhaps to understand the opinion of Tosos, Makom Gidulo, that perhaps Me'amer is the end of the reaping process. It's the end of the kotzer process. You have to cut things down and you also have to gather them together. That's how you finish the harvest. So it's one big package, and certainly that package of harvesting, of cutting and gathering together, that would certainly be considered creative and therefore would be a Melacha on Shabbos.
Obviously the other side of this gathering together is the other mitzvah we have when we harvest is the matnot aniyim, which is leket, shichicha, and pe'ah. Leket and shichicha is the ones that are dropped or left behind, which don't get into that piling together. So obviously back in the day, piling together when you harvest is really part of the actual action of harvesting, and whatever's left behind is just left behind. It's not part of the whole action of harvesting.
And it's actually pretty cool. We're talking about, as the Gemara calls it, sidura de pas, the process of making bread. That's how the Melachos were organized, so it'd be easy for us to remember. So we talked about planting, plowing, and cutting it down and bundling it together, and we have a few more steps as we'll learn in the coming weeks. In the old days, it was done separately. Each step along the way. But nowadays, if you take a drive down Yerushalayim Highway to Tel Aviv and you see the big fields on the sides of the road, so you'll see these big machines called combines. And what those combines do are actually go through all these steps in one big machine. So it's not that things are cut and left out and gathered together. In the machine, they're cut down, they're gathered, and we'll learn about the subsequent steps, which is clear, as you're saying, Tuvia, this is an integral part of the process of harvesting grain, harvesting a field, is to gather things together.
And talking about gathering things together, one of the pillars of our Jewish life is gathering together for us. Also, whether it's in a minyan, for any davar shebekdusha, or even for simchas, or even for mitzvahs, we're always about being the collective together, whether it's just a minyan of people, whether it's the tzibur, as we say, tzadikim binyanim mishayim, we're always looking at gathering together because there's a lot more strength for a gathering than being individuals. And the example is always given, you can take one pencil and break it up, but if you hold a bunch of pencils together, try to break them up, you won't be able. So in the end of the day, bottom line, it is safe to say that there is a new creation here in the world when things are gathered together. So those are very nice thoughts about Me'amer. Are there any implications for today's day and age?
So as we said, unless you're actually sticking it or tying it together, it would only apply b'makom gidulo, in the place where it actually grew. The Mishnah Berurah mentions that if you have a fruit tree, you do have to be pretty careful about this because the shear of Me'amer is quite small. I mean, the amount for which you have to gather to be in violation of Me'amer is pretty small. The Sagachav Rebbe actually says 2 fruit together would be a violation of Me'amer. And therefore, if you have a fruit tree and the fruit fell before Shabbos, because if they fell on Shabbos, they would be muksa. But if they fell before Shabbos, you can eat them. You just have to be careful not to put them together. This would apply to leaves falling as well. If the leaves fell before Shabbos, you would not be able to gather the leaves because they fell in the place where they grow. However, once you bring the fruit inside your house, even if it spills afterwards, it would be okay to gather them back up together, unless it's a very large area, which might be a different problem. It's scattered in a huge hall or something. But in your house, that would be okay to gather up together because it's not in makom gidulo anymore, and there's no problem of redoing Me'amer. We mentioned before that the Shulchan Aruch says sticking things together are a problem even if it's in your house, even if it's at a later stage. And so perhaps one practical application of this would be the old Tu B'Shvat necklaces where you stick together the fruit onto a string, so that would be tying it together. If the fruit are in their original form, it would be a problem to put together on the chain. However, the Aruch HaShulchan notes that since the original Melacha of Me'amer is taking the things that are cut from the field and putting them together, it's only a problem when the fruit or vegetables are in their original form. That's when it's a problem to put it together. But if it's processed and now it's in a new form, that would be okay. So if you make some pie and you stick together cut up fruit, that would be okay because that's processed and it's not its original form. Perhaps the example that puts most fear into a mother who wants to keep her house clean is gathering toys that are scattered all together around the room. Maybe it's a problem to gather the toys. So that would be okay because even if they're wooden toys, so they do actually grow in the ground, they are processed, it's at a later stage, it's not b'makom gidulan, and therefore it would be okay.
And of course, all the kids hearing this and worried about gathering the candies in shul and a simcha, that's not a problem also.
You're right. So the kids can have their fun in shul.
Wonderful. Super interesting as usual.
Absolutely. And like always, once you get a little deeper, you go back to the sources, you get a better sense and a better understanding of how it all works.
Amazing. So we'll talk again next week, please, guys.